This past summer, you probably were not able to miss it much, but I think it was the 33rd Olympics that were held this summer in Paris. And to a large degree, these modern Olympics have become quite the media production. There are just so many logistics with all the different venues and trying to record and broadcast everything. And viewership was down this year, but typically, you're talking millions and millions of people around the planet as they want to watch these athletic events. And of course, every Olympic event has its share of triumphs and even controversy. There was some of that this past year as well, in some of the gymnastic routines especially. But many of the triumphs are highlighted, like the most gold medals won. I've never really understood why that's such an amazing thing to see how many countries do. I think that goes back to the Cold War era. But if there are records broken or things of that nature, but not all triumphs make the highlights shown on television. And I want to go back in time a little bit, maybe past the lifespans of some of you here, but in the 1968 Summer Olympics, they were held in Mexico City. And that Olympic was the first for a lot of different things. One was that it was the first Olympiad held in a Spanish-speaking country. That was unique, and so far is the only one to be held in Latin America. It was the first to broadcast the closing ceremonies in color, which was brand new technology at the time. The high altitude of the city caused many athletes to struggle in their efforts. They had not anticipated that difference in altitude and what it would make in their performance. And while there were many memorable events during that Olympic season, if you will, there were some that were quite notable. Some of you might remember, while receiving their medals, Tommy Smith and John Carlos of the U.S. infamously held up their fists instead of saluting the flag while the national American anthem was being played. Bob Beamon set a world record in the long jump. 29.199 feet was a world record at the time. That record stood for 23 years. Another notable event was Dick Fosbury. Anybody remember who Dick Fosbury is? Dick Fosbury won the high jump with his now famous Fosbury flop. Prior to Dick Fosbury, everybody tried to hurdle the high jump. Dick Fosbury does the famous backflip over the bar, which is the standard now for that event. But there was another notable athlete at the 1968 Summer Olympics that was a marathon runner you've probably never heard of. His name was John Stephen Akhwari. He came from Tanzania. John Stephen finished last in the marathon event. His time was 3 hours, 25 minutes, 27 seconds. It was about an hour after the first place runner crossed at 2 hours, 20 minutes, 26 seconds. During the race at about the mile 18 marker, John Stephen was tired from the run, from the altitude. Again, he had not anticipated the difference that would make. And in his fatigue, he stumbled and fell. And when he fell, he did quite a gash on his leg. It was bleeding pretty bad. They bandaged up his knee. He insisted on continuing the race, but it continued to be a problem. He would run for a distance, he would stop, he would walk, he would continue running, and so forth, over and over again. He was determined to finish the race. The marathon event was late in the day, and by the time John Stephen entered the arena, all the other runners had finished, and many were actually setting up for the next event, not realizing John Stephen was still completing the course. A few spectators noticed what was going on. He kind of limp ran his last lap there in the stadium, but as spectators began to realize what was happening, they began to applaud him, even though he was the last runner. He was actually the last of 57 runners in that marathon event. He finished last, as I said, but what's notable as well is that there were 74 who started and never finished. After John Stephen finished running, received medical care to patch up his knee, he was interviewed by a number of the different outlets, but one journalist asked him, "Why did you keep going?" And his response was very simple. He said, "You don't understand. My country did not send me 5,000 miles to start a race. They sent me to finish it. I think most people enjoy the Olympics because of these kinds of stories. If I would ask anyone here, probably anyone in general, who the first place finisher was for the marathon in 1968 Olympics, they probably couldn't tell you a name. But there are many people who remember John Stephen. And in my sermon time today, I want to consider the spiritual race that is set before us, especially as we lead up to the Feast of Tabernacles and the Fall Holy Days and all that they represent. Then I liked John Stephen's comment there that we're not called to start a race, we're called to finish it. And our race is about staying the course, isn't it? We heard a bit of that in the sermonette. Growing in his character, crossing the finish line, no matter the obstacles, no matter the difficulties along the way. I'd like to begin in Scripture today in Hebrews chapter 12. The Apostle Paul was very familiar with the Olympics. These were major events in the Roman world. And they had their own notables, if you will, their own famous athletes that they would recognize during that time. And even the Apostle Paul saw some of the similarities that we're going to talk about here today. So in Hebrews 12 and verse 1, he says, "Therefore, we also, since we're surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin that so easily ensnares us, let us run with endurance the race that is set before us." One of the controversies that has crept into some modern sports, especially long-distance running, are the advances that have been made in various materials that actually certain shoes are banned in the marathons because they feel it gives a disadvantage because of their springiness, if you will, that it will help runners. But it's all about the weight, isn't it? You want to run with the least amount of weight on you. And he's talking about this here as well. Let us lay aside every weight. Let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. Paul explains this a little bit further in Philippians 3, if we want to go there next. Philippians chapter 3. And in verse 14, he says, "I press towards the goal for the prize of the upward call of God in Christ Jesus." Pressing towards this. The interesting thing about long-distance running is that you're considered to be part of an event where you're racing against others. But if you talk with most runners, I ran quite a bit in high school and college, it's really the race against yourself. Most athletes of that caliber, they're really competing against themselves to do better on whatever level it is they're performing at. And Paul is reminding us here that while we can experience hindrances from others, right? We have the outside influences, we have the distractions, we have the hurdles, if you will. Only we can make the final decision as to whether we give up or not. No one's going to force us out unless we allow that. Paul even then has some encouragement back in Galatians chapter 5. Well, this is part of what John Stephen saw, if you will. He realized that he had been given a responsibility by his nation to go represent his nation. He was going to fulfill that responsibility, even if it meant he was last. But I find it very interesting to go back to that statistic. Originally, there were 131 runners in that event. Even though he finished last of the runners, he actually finished higher up in the rankings because there were 74 that never finished. So Galatians 5 and verse 7, Paul says here to the congregation at Galatia, he says, "You ran well. You were doing well. Who hindered you from obeying the truth?" Because they had neglected certain things. We have to remember that as well. If the race is not against each other, which it's not. This is the parable of the workers in the vineyard, right? At the end of the day, they all got paid the same. Salvation is salvation. There is no more or less salvation, right? So the race is against us, ourselves, that is, how we are going to do. So look at us sitting here today. We can be discouraged I grew up in the Cincinnati area when I was a boy. On holy days, by the time I left for college in the early 80s, we had to rent the convention center because we were about 2,200 people, just in Cincinnati, right? That's about a third of United's attendance right now in the United States. So we have a feast site of 700 people. We think that's huge. The Wisconsin Dells had 14,000 people when it was a feast site. Ozarks wasn't much different. But how many people started, just pick your life, how many people started when God called you that are no longer a part of this? And I go back to Cincinnati, I only know of one person that is my age that still attends from when I was a boy. That can be discouraging, but it can also be encouraging in the fact that I'm still here. But that's not my glory. That's what God is doing with us in this, as if we flesh this out. I also want to finish this race. As John Stevens said, there are a lot of people that I want to see again. My grandparents are dead. My grandfather had a great influence on my life later, as I was an older teenager especially. I want to see my parents again. My mom died in 2008. My dad just died 2 years ago November. There are many other faithful that had great influence in my life that I want to see again. Spiritual heroes, men and women who I saw as the pinnacle, if you will. As a younger person, I saw as someone that I wanted to emulate in the depth of knowledge, the experience of living God's way of life. I saw the blessings that came from living God's way of life. And I watched others run these races. And some have stumbled and left the race, if you will. But others are very notable for their steadfastness. There are many other faithful who I want to embrace. Names that would mean nothing to you, but they were a great influence in my life. But God's faithful will be spirit beings. This is the calling that we've been given. This way of life that God explains through His Word, especially through His holy days, shows us the meaning of life. What is the purpose of it all? There are a lot of people in the world right now that have no purpose in life. And I think that's why we see so much anger and hostility. They don't know why they even exist. And yet we do. We'll be married as a bride to Christ. And then what does He have in mind? I don't know. We don't have anything past Revelation 22. But I can only imagine what God has in mind with what He's already doing. I don't think we'll be bored in the least. But to reestablish His kingdom, to be part of that for eternity? Let's go back to Revelation chapter 3. Who do you want to see? In running your race, who is meaningful for you to be with at the end of that race? That's not a wrong thing to be motivated by the example of others. We have in Hebrews 11 a list of some of those faithful as examples to us. But in Revelation 3 and verse 11, we read here is the letter to the church at Philadelphia. He says, "Behold, I am coming quickly. Hold fast what you have, that no one may take your crown." No one can take our crown unless we allow it to be taken. It's ours to have. God will magnify what He's doing through us, in us, what we become because of Him. But we're the only one that can determine if we lose. Because this race is not about first place. It's about finishing the race. In a race like a marathon, it's easy to think about stopping and quitting. I've run a marathon. I did one when I was in college. I ran a time similar to John Stephen, and I didn't bang up my knee like he did, and he still finished faster than I did. But it's very enlightening because you get past about mile 14, 18 in there, and it's just willpower for the most part. You've had the training, now it's the mental game. Will I just keep doing this until it's done? We must remember that God's called us to this race to finish it. And we read here, again, in Revelation 3:11, to not let anyone take that away from us. The whole crown thing is a very interesting aspect of the marathon in ancient Rome and Greece, but let's go back to 1 Corinthians 9. The crown that was given was usually a crown of laurel leaves. So they would take this off of a bush and they would braid it. You've probably seen images of this. It's a very temporary crown, isn't it? How long is that going to last? A day or two, and then it starts to shrivel up and die, and then it's no good. In 1 Corinthians 9, Paul talks about this as well. In verse 24, he says, "Do you not know that those who run in a race all run, but one receives a prize?" Right? There's no participation trophy. You get noticed if you're first place or first loser or second loser, right? You're not first place. You're second or third. But he says they all run this race, but only one receives the prize. So he says, run in such a way that you may obtain it. Run as if it's first place. Right? Because again, what is the standard we're being judged against? The standard is Christ. But then it's the standard as we live up to it, how we are judged. I'm not judged according to you, and you're not judged according to me. What have we done with the calling that God has given us? And that starts, as even young people in the church, that started with me long before I was baptized. I knew what the standard was. I had lived it with my family. But it comes down to whether we will or not. I mentioned the apparel, what industry that has become to maximize the ability of the runner to not have those things work against them. The clothing that is so lightweight that doesn't become heavy. You know, the man-made materials that will wick moisture away, not hold it. Maybe you've experienced that in the middle of summer and you wear a cotton t-shirt and how heavy it will actually get just from the sweat. Again, you can write, well, let's just go ahead and go there so I don't summarize it too much, but let's go to Hebrews chapter 12. We read this earlier, but I want to come back to it and continue on. So again, Paul says here, therefore, we also, since we're surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin that so easily ensnares us. Let us run with endurance. It doesn't say how fast we have to run, right? Just run. One of the most humbling things that happened to me in that marathon that I ran was that I got to about mile 19 or 20, and I started being passed by old women and children. You know, and I'm, 23 years old, and I think I'm full of vim and vigor, and I've been running quite a bit, but it didn't matter, did it? I wasn't at that same ability. I don't know how long they had been running, what abilities they had that I didn't have, but it's endurance, isn't it? It's finishing the race. Verse 2, notice how we look to Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith. If we try to run the race on our own energy, we will fail. I've seen this happen with people because we think it's up to us. We have to be engaged, but who starts it, who finishes it? It says here, Jesus Christ does, who for the joy set before him endured the cross. Think of his race. I mean, outside of his mom and stepdad, I don't know that the rest of his family really understood who he was and what he was doing until he was crucified. So, what friends did he have? What support did he have? What encouragement did he have? I don't know. I'm sure he had some, but probably not what we would want if we were facing the same thing. And yet, it says he had joy to go through this for us. He was determined to finish it, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of God, the right hand of the throne of God. Verse 3, for considering him who endured such hostility from sinners against himself, lest you become weary and discouraged in your souls. And that's the mental game that can happen, right? You're 5 miles from finishing and your body is saying, why are you doing this? Right? We can be 40 years down the road in our calling, and maybe you have family, maybe even voices in your own head saying, why are you doing this? Because again, going back to verse 2, if we don't remember who the author and finisher is, we can think it is up to us alone. And we would be doing ourselves a great disservice. Now, I loved running as a young man. I was never very fast in that sense of being that level of competition. But for me, the enjoyment I always had was I could just disconnect. I could run and I could just let my mind go to other places, and it was cathartic for me. But it has to be something you want to do. Right? You can't force somebody to be engaged in a calling. You can't demand of someone to be engaged and to endure. It has to come from the heart, doesn't it? It has to come from internal. We don't need special equipment or facilities. That was one of the other things I loved about running, right? You put on a pair of shorts and a shirt, your shoes, and you just go out. I didn't need equipment. I didn't need to go someplace to do this. I could do it whenever I had time to do it. But it's not an easy race, is it? At times it can be very difficult. But it is a race that each one of us can finish if we have the desire to finish. One of the most sad things I've ever heard, an individual that attended for a time when I was a young man, and the family was one of those families that just seemed like everything they touched was successful. And yet when hard times came on the church around 1995, he began to question a lot of what he was doing. Questioning it by itself is not wrong. It's the answers that you come to. And for some reason, he decided to go back and figure up all the tithes and offerings he'd ever given to the church over the years. To what end, I still don't understand. I think he was looking for justification in his mind. And so he did this, and he thought to himself, he expressed this to others, he's looking at it like a return on investment. What do I have? I've given all this money. What do I have? And because he looked at it that way, he couldn't see what he had. But what do you have? What would you give for eternal life? I have sat, Mr. Dobson probably has as well, by the bedside of people as they die. They can be in the hospital, they can be in hospice or whatever. At that point, they don't care about so many things that people care about. Right? And for someone that is part of God's church, the only thing they care about is being in God's kingdom. And yet there have been people that have lamented about time they didn't spend with their family, the things that they chased that were of no value. Ultimately, there can be great regret. And there's nothing sadder than to see somebody who has regret when they die, because they don't see hope. Let's go back to 2 Timothy 2. We can have great hope in the calling that we have. It can seem at times burdensome, the calling that we have, because we're at odds with the world, aren't we? We're at odds with ourselves at times. We want, as we heard in the sermon, that we want justice now. We want things fixed now. And when those things are delayed, if we're not careful, we can lose hope. But we have to live according to the life that God has established. So, part of my background, just to give you a little bit of a glimpse of me, I went to Ambassador College. Some of you remember what that was, the college that Worldwide Church of God had. Before that, I went to art school, actually. I was a commercial artist for almost 26 years. While I was in art school, there was one young lady that was late one day. She was never late, so everybody was wondering, where's so-and-so? She finally showed up about halfway through the day, and the reason why she was late was that she had stopped to get gas, and this was back at a time period where still a lot of gas stations pumped gas for you. Okay, so she drove up. She needed gas. The attendant came. She told him, fill it up. He did. She paid. She drove not even half a block, and the car stopped. So she doesn't know what's going on. She calls her dad. He comes down. He quickly figures out the attendant did not put gasoline in the car. The attendant put diesel in the car. Okay, well, gasoline engines are not designed to run on diesel, right? So you have to follow the instructions, don't you? You have to operate the vehicle in the manner in which it was engineered to be functional. So in 2 Timothy 2 and verse 1 here, Paul writes to Timothy, he says, therefore, my son, be strong in the grace that is in Christ Jesus and the things that you have heard from me among many witnesses, right? This building of relationships and the generation coming along, learning from the generation that's preceded them. He says, remember these things, commit them to faithful men. You then pass them on. You pass them on to faithful men who will teach others as well. You therefore must endure hardship as a good soldier. It's all peaches and cream. But he says, no one engaged in warfare entangles himself with the affairs of this life. Right? You can't be focused on anything else in the middle of a battle or you're going to lose your life. But he says that he may please him who enlisted him as a soldier. And also anyone else that competes in athletics, he is not crowned unless he competes according to the rules. So I still remember the individual. I think her name was Rosie Ruiz, running a New York marathon. And she stunned everybody because this was an unknown runner before this time, and she won the women's division of the New York Marathon. It's one of the premier marathons in the world. Well, they decided to check up on it, and they went back and they found out she cheated. At about mile 18, she got a taxi, skipped the course to about mile 22, got out and ran the rest of the distance. Well, that's quite the advantage, isn't it? She did not race according to the rules. You can have a reputation that's not a good reputation, but it has to be according to the rules, right? So God lays out rules for us. What are the rules that we have? We certainly have His commandments. We have His instructions concerning the holy days, the Sabbath. We have His principles of relationships and what we're to learn and do and become. That's the endurance part, living up to those things, being a part of that, being engaged. But it's according to the rules, isn't it? Now, God's not an onerous God. One of the really amazing things to me about God's way of life is it is not quid pro quo, right? I do X, you do Y. That's an exchange, isn't it? The amazing thing about God's way of life is that if I do X, He gives me Y to the 10th. Right? It's not an even exchange. He blesses way beyond what the original thing was because He's a loving God. The rules are important, but He's the finisher of our faith, isn't He? So He gives us, He helps us to accomplish those things. If we continue here in this chapter, later down, verse 14, Paul again says to Timothy, remind them of these things, charging them before the Lord not to strive about with words with no profit to the ruin of the hearers. There are also things that we need to avoid, like not wearing boots when you're trying to run a marathon, right? That's just going to set you back. Okay, striving about words becomes no profit. There's still too much of that, and even in the church at times. But he says, be diligent to present yourself to be approved. Right? That's our race. Our race is not our husband, our spouse, our children, our relatives. That's not our race. Our race is our race. I had a friend that was a lifeguard over the summer. That was the way he made money when he was a teenager. I still remember something he said to me. They're obviously trained in first aid, and drowning's a big concern. But he said, you never swim up to somebody in distress directly. He says, because if you do, they will try to climb out of the water on top of you. right? He says you have to come up behind them. You have to come up behind them and grab them around the shoulder, under the neck, because they can't reach back and hurt you. He says, then you can help them. You have to help yourself. You have to make yourself safe before you can help anybody else. This is part of what I get here. Be diligent to present yourself approved, a worker who does not need to be ashamed, because you're doing what you need to do. We have other verses, such as James 1, verse 12, talks about being blessed to endure. But let's look at 1 Corinthians 13 again. Go back to that area. 1 Corinthians 13, verse 7. Paul here is talking about the greatest gift, right? Chapter 12, this is one of the issues, if you will, that the congregation at Corinth had, is that God had blessed them with what we call spiritual gifts. Some could speak many languages. Some had the gift of healing. That would just be something amazing. I have seen divine healing, but to have somebody that would be that connected to God. Anyway, they were using it to hurt each other. That was the problem. They weren't using it to God's glory. And so he corrects them, and in verse 13 says, there's something even better than speaking in languages, having the gift of administration, or any of these other things. So he begins to talk about love here, doesn't he? So in verse 7, he says about love that it bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. When you're not treated right, when you're not validated, when you're not recognized, when you're marginalized, when you're spoken out about unfairly, do we still love as we should love? Do we still endure? We have examples, even going back to Hebrews, about those in chapter 11 that endured. Look at what they endured. I cannot imagine being Jeremiah, somebody like Jeremiah, who prophesied for decades, and almost nobody responded. And then at the end, he's speaking for God, right? He's going to the king, he's going to the nobles of the country, and he's saying, look, just yield to this. God's already determined this is going to happen. Just yield to this, and it will be okay. And they say, you're a spy. Then what do? They throw him in a cesspool. The indication I have is he's about up to here in all this muck. He doesn't know if he's going to live or die. The smell is probably choking him. And there's no one. There's literally no one there. Until somebody who's not even an Israelite comes and has pity on him and helps him out. And we have other examples. Look how long Abraham waited. I kind of understand why they thought they had to take it into their own hands for the heir of promise. But 25 years? And yet he did endure. Look at Noah. 120 years of preaching, 0 return. And yet he did. I love that expression. If you go back and read the account, it said, Noah did. He just did what God asked him to do. As I alluded to earlier, in the sporting event, there really is no reward for only going part of the distance. John Stephen Aquari understood that. To him, finishing the race was everything. Didn't matter what his standing was. It was everything. Because finishing is all the more rewarding. Especially when you overcome things. He knew his leg was bleeding. He knew he was compromised. He knew he could have done better, but he was still going to finish. What is interesting, if you go back and read the account of his life, when he got home, he became part of their National Athletic Council to set up training for future athletes. They so were impressed with his dedication, and he became a national figure for the rest of his life. Would the same thing have happened if he'd actually won first place? I don't know, maybe. But it still didn't matter in the end, did it? Because of his attitude, his desire to represent the nation that had sent him there. You know, when I was waiting for Mr. Dobson this morning to pick me up, I was looking up and you just get that little bit of the crescent moon in the sky still. We're like, 6 weeks away or so? We're not that far from the fall holy days. And these holy days are all about hope, aren't they? The return of Jesus Christ, the removal of Satan, Christ reigning on earth for 1,000 years to show mankind what is truly possible under his reign, and then the fairness of God in the last great day. Everybody who has ever lived and died and never known why they exist will have opportunity to understand God's plan for them, to be part of his family. In those holy days, we picture all of this, God's rule and faithfulness and fairness, and ultimately the evil men do not win. They may go to their grave thinking they've just pulled one over on everybody, but in the end they haven't. And we also picture a time that we're going to be a part of. This is not going to heaven, sitting on a cloud, plugging a heart for the rest of eternity, gazing at the magnificence of Christ across the way. I would be bored after the first 100 years. Right? But we're not. We're going to be ruling with him, and that's not rulership as the world pride. This is going to be serving God's people. It's going to be teaching those who never understood their point of life. It's going to be repairing relationships. I mentioned Mr. Dobson in our conversations driving over here. One of my personal heresies, for what it's worth, is that the last great day, I think we will spend most of that time period, whatever that is, helping people repair relationships. Because how many fractured families do you know? And broken relationships that went to the grave that have to be repaired. In Luke 4, I think it is, Christ talked about, reading from Isaiah 61, about healing the brokenhearted. That's a bigger challenge than healing a broken body. But I want to be there. I mentioned some of those earlier in my message that I want to see again. Not just for selfish reasons, that we can all rejoice together. We finished. I want all that have been called by God to be there. I want you to be there. I want to see those faithful who died in the faith, doing what God asked them to do. Individuals that I want to be with again. And again, we have not been called to start the race. We've been called to finish it. And we'll only see the fulfillment of God's fall holy days plan and the fulfillment of our part of that race. So let's conclude with one last scripture, 2 Timothy chapter 4. 2 Timothy 4, and in verse 7. Paul's letter here, this second letter to Timothy, is full of encouragement. Paul is trying to impart and pass on to Timothy a strong sense of responsibility, but also encouragement. So even in chapter 2, he's talking about him being strong in the faith that he's been given, the calling that he's been given. But in chapter 3, recognizing, as it says, the perilous times, verse 1, perilous days. If they were perilous for Paul, what are they now? And he talks about the selfishness and the brutality of mankind, what it'll look like. But he says, at the end of chapter 3, he reminds Timothy to be a man of God. And I think of Joshua's encouragement from God himself to say, be strong, right? Be of good courage. You can do this because I'm right behind you. So in chapter 4 and verse 7, Paul then says here, he says, I have fought the good faith. Paul's looking at the end of his life. He knows he's only got a short time, right? He's in Rome. He's chained to that Roman guard. He knows the emperor's not predisposed to be kind to him. And he kind of sees the handwriting on the wall. But he's not dejected here. He says, I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. It's not a matter of bragging, but a matter of recognition. I have done what I've been asked to do. I committed to this. I saw it through. He says, I have kept the faith. So he says, there's laid up for me a crown of righteousness, not the temporary crown of the Roman Olympics. And it's going to fade and die away in a few days. The temporary recognition Who remembers the first place of anything, even this past summer? Very few people would. But as I said, who even remembers from years ago? Who was the first place Olympic runner for the 1968 Olympics? Those things fade, don't they? But he says, I fought the good fight. I have fought, if I can rephrase this, I have fought the right fight. Right? Because the fight of the world, that's not our fight. That's God's responsibility. He'll fix that in the right time, the right way, to the best outcome possible. It's my fight. And Paul says this, I have fought my fight good. I have finished the race. So verse 8, finally, there's laid up for me a crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will give to me on that day. Like John and Stephen, Paul says, I came, I did. I finished. He will give to me on that day. And almost every translation capitalizes the word day because they recognize that's the time of judgment. Right? For the faithful called now in this lifetime, that's the resurrection to eternal life that we understand happens in the fulfillment of the Feast of Trumpets. To stand before Christ and to say, well done. So he says, he'll give it to me on that day, and not to me only, but also to all who have loved his appearing. What a group that will be. What a family it will be moving forward. My point today is to encourage you to finish your race and the reward that awaits you. So let's be like the true and faithful down through time so that we can hear from Christ and we can say to him, I have finished the race, I have kept the faith.